had more people living in it per square foot than anywhere else in the world except Calcutta, India. It was a place where the waves of immigrants collided, a place where old world ignorance and hatred struggled against new world reality. It was where families began. It was in the North End that Crescenzio Mastoni would have his first child. He was named Liberdado. Today he is 82. Most people call him Al.
My father was the first man from his town to come to Boston. He was alone, no strings. Even though he was that young, but he had the mentality of a person 20, 25, or 30. There was no time for play, no time for nothing.
Al had his first child here, also a son, named Crescenzio, after his grandfather. Today, he is Dr. Chris Mastoni.
I was the first son of the first son. I remember my grandfather used to never tell you, but you'd look, you know, and you see the little twinkle in the other thing. A lot of little things that he did, like dinner couldn't start unless I was in the house. I remember when I was working, I'd get home at 3 in the morning. I made my grandmother get up and cook for me.
13 weeks ago, Chris Mastoni's daughter, Elaine, gave birth to Crescenzio's great-great-granddaughter, Stacy Morris. Today, Al Mastoni still lives near his father's house on Salem Street. He lives at 193, at the high end where Salem meets Charter Street, and Charter runs to Snow Hill and Greenough. These were Irish streets in 1900.
My father worked for the city. He was a rubbish collector. They knew when they come here, they got a pick and a shovel. That's the best they could do.
James McGonigal lived on Snow Hill Street. He was a fireman.
They had one class of Irish people that were good. That was the mothers, just, you know, newborn mothers that these rich people in the Back Bay would take them for mammies to feed their young. That's about the only class that was good. The other ones, they just built the subways here and here in New York, and that's as far as they went for a while, till they got smart and knew that their weight would carry them a little bit.
The Irish had been coming to the North End since 1824, the first year of what would be 60 years of famine in Ireland. They were the first wave. The Irish dominated the North End. They filled the police stations, the firehouses, the union halls, and Honey Fitz's political clubs. Honey Fitz, John Fitzgerald, first American-born Irish mayor of Boston, grandfather of President John Kennedy.
I used to love to hear John F. come down the North End and make a speech. You know, he used to say, when I come down here, the very cobblestones seem to rise up to greet me. He'd have them crying. Half of them understand him and half didn't know what the hell he was talking about.
The Irish were the first to live the universal immigrant experience of grinding labor and low wages. They were the first to be tied to the new machines of America's great industrial revolution. Back in 1845, there were only 473 tailors in Boston. Then a Cambridge man named Howe invented the sewing machine. And in 5 years, there were 1,600 tailors. 1,000 were Irish. Most were women who made $3 a week sewing at home. The Jews and the Italians were the next wave to reach Salem Street. The Italians fled poverty. The Jews fled the Tsar.
My grandfather, when he came here, was sick, and the sickness was due to his walking large distances from Poland into Germany at the time of the pogroms.
Sam Gervitz's father ran a kosher restaurant.
He was in the kosher restaurant business until my mother died. My mother usually was the cook. They always had the desire for their children to get an education and become professional people. And a lot of people have asked me many times, well, why did you become a lawyer? And the only answer was because I had a Jewish mother. She didn't want a businessman, she wanted a professional man.
In 1900, half of the North End's adult male Jews were self-employed. And even if the Irish were jealous, the reality of Jewish independence was no bargain. In 1891, the salaried Irish worker took home $510 a year. The independent Jew, $396. In 1893, the year Henry Ford built his first car, Crescenzio Mastoni, age 15, took his first job as a day laborer. He joined work gangs in the Carolinas, construction crews in Virginia, loggers in Vermont. He breathed nitroglycerin fumes in quarries in Maine. The year that Teddy Roosevelt charged San Juan Hill, Crescenzio Mastoni was a railroad roustabout in New Hampshire. By the early 1900s, he was a respected heavy construction man in Boston, a bracer.
Bracing is the timbering to support buildings from caving in as they were digging trenches for foundations. He never could read and write. There were no schools at the time where he could go at night. And when they got through with 12 or 14 hours of work, they didn't have time to learn how to read or write. He could read the measurements because he knew figures, but he didn't know letters.
The waves of immigration continued. The century turned, and the new century would see 30 years on Salem Street that would be unlike any time before or since. In 1902, Crescenzio Mastoni and Maria Cataldo, a girl from Avellino, Italy, were married. Crescenzio Mastoni and Maria Cataldo were married in 1902, and their first child was due in the summer of 1903.
When my mother got close to the time to delivery, my great-aunt lived in Paul Revere's house. Because my mother didn't know the language, wasn't able to get around, my father asked her to go and live with her aunt. And then, August 20th, 1903, they sent for the midwife, Madeline, who lived on Sheaf Street. She came over to the Paul Revere's house, and I was introduced into this world.
8 days later, Libertado Mastoni was baptized at the Sacred Heart Church. 111 days later, the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk.
How you going?
There are not so many children's voices in the North End of 1986. Rent is high, over $1,000 a month. A lot of young professionals live here, or older people who have paid off their mortgages. But children's skateboards still echo in the narrow alleys, and bicycles make their way up Lower Salem Street. For many of the people who sit at these windows, the North End of 1910 is a romantic memory mellowed by time. But those days were filled with conflict as language, religion, culture, and custom were compressed into one street already overflowing with each family's personal struggle. The American melting pot did not simmer, it boiled. The children of yesterday's Salem Street were witnesses to centuries-old prejudices, hatreds, and stereotypes. They were also witnesses to small and great deeds of friendship, loyalty, and neighborliness. Over time, they would carry these experiences forward. Over time, many of the harsher images would fade. Attitudes change. But the echoes are there, as these children, now grown old, remember. Rosa Giampola lived on Foster Street then.
We had Irish and we had Jewish people. We had Polish, you know. We had a mixture. The Jewish people were good people to do business with, I thought. But the Irish kind of, I think, resented the Italians as neighbors. The Jewish people didn't. As long as you did business with them, nothing else mattered. I remember my father telling me that usually their bosses were Irish, and they looked upon the Italian people as being very stupid people. But it wasn't that at all. It was the language barrier.
When they first come over, nobody spoke your language. You know, you couldn't understand what they were talking about. They couldn't understand you. So they figure you were out of their class, and you figure you were out of their class. But they were nice people. They were nice people when they first come over. Very nice.
I can always remember that about Easter time, we had our problems with the Catholic community. And the problem was primarily based on the fact that we were supposed to be Christ killers. And they would say to us, Mazza Christa, which meant in Italian, you killed Christ. And of course, they got that from their parents. I'm sure that they weren't born with it.
Catherine de Cesare lived in Norwell at the time and visited her brother in the North End frequently. She would later marry Al Mastoni.
On North Street, on Powers Court, there was the Irish. They were so prejudiced against the Italians. In order to go to school, if I wanted to go the shortest way, I'd have to go up North Street. Ooh, I couldn't go to North Street. They'd stone us to death. 2 Irish girls, Katie and Sadie. I never forgot them. And there was also a little boy with them. A chunky little boy that I found out later when I got married that it was Al. He was helping them.
Stella McGonigal.
He was American and I was Polish, and Mother would say, you go at your own kind. You don't want to go over there, you know, you stay in this neighborhood. We were afraid. My sister, my older sister, had married an Italian boy, and then I married him, and we ended up with all kinds, Jewish, Italian, Polish, Irish, you name it, we have it.
But there was one area in which the Jews, Italians, and Irish found common ground. There was no room for black people in the North End. By 1900, the black population of Boston had increased 600% to 14,000. The death rate for blacks was double that for whites. What went on in these alleys was nothing new. It was a social cycle of immigration that continues today. The immigrant that struggled to come to America resented the immigrant who came next. Each succeeding immigrant was willing to take a lower wage or a job that seemingly no one wanted, until he took it.
The day I got my first job, there was a boy in the store who must have been about 14. He was Irish. And I happened to walk in, and I took the job at 50 cents for the day, from 6 to whatever. And he turned around to the boy and he said, I told you I was overpaying you. You see what I can get. That didn't go over too well.
The Carangelo's grocery store and meat market. This place is a time capsule, filled with the artifacts of immigrants, the debris of their history. Moxie bottles, 8-cent Panatella cigars, meat hooks that used to hold rabbit and lamb, matches, whose sulfur is now turned to powder. The Mastonis used to come here every day. They didn't have refrigerators then, so they shopped for every night's dinner. It was Fred Carangelo's grandfather who started this store. Before that, he was a barber in Connecticut and in Italy. Today, his grandson is an aspiring actor. I guess if there's a difference between the Carangelos of today and of yesterday, it's then, if you were an immigrant, you did whatever you had to do. You took advantage of what was available to make a living. And you left the luxury of choice and personal dreams to another generation. At the time, economists calculated that the average American family needed $900 a year to survive. The average immigrant worker earned $400 a year, if he spoke English, and if he was white. It was a world where 6 million adults were unemployed, while 2 million children worked in factories and mines.
I and my brothers used to sleep in the kitchen. My father and my mother and the babies slept in one room, and my sisters slept in the others. And there was a kitchen stove in there. And that was the only heat that the apartment had at that time.
It was also a world of the very rich and no income taxes. Behind the front parlors of these mansions were the butler's pantries and back kitchens, filled with immigrant children, illiterate, their pale faces older than their 10 years, short arms scrubbing tiled floors for long hours. There was sickness and no money for medicine. On March 5th, 1912, Elena Mastoni, Al's sister, age 18 months, died.
What made it worse is one of my sisters was sick. My mother felt like crying, but she didn't dare. She didn't want my sister, the rest of them, to see her. So she would call me. I'd go into one of the rooms with her, and I said to her, "Ma, let it out." She'd sit there, she cried, and when I thought she had cried long enough, I'd say, "Ma, let's go outside."
But no matter how grim life was in the slums of the North End, it was better than the famines of Ireland, the ghettos of Poland, or the tired land of Avellino. The U.S. population stood at nearly 91 million. Nearly 10% were immigrants who had arrived since 1900. They would become the first rank and file of big American unions. The needs of American industry for cheap labor fed on the immigrant desire to dig his feet into the country. Competition for jobs increased. Families increased. There was exploitation and fear. The Lawrence strike at American Woolen Company. Mabel Gillespie organized telephone operators and cleaning ladies in Boston. Rosa Giampola worked in a clothing factory.
A lot of them didn't like you to ask for a raise. They'd rather not argue and make sure they had their job. It was very important to them. But I was young, just starting out. I'd rather fight for it and get it, or I'd rather go on to someplace else. I would tell the ladies, the girls, to stop their machines. And of course, when the machines are not running, the owner would come to find out what's wrong. And that would be the time he would listen to us, because we told him we weren't going to start those machines again unless we would get what we thought was a fair price.
The immigrants began to feel the power of their numbers, and so did the government. In Washington, a bill began to move through Congress calling for literacy tests for all immigrants. The glow of the new century was gone. Europe continued to unravel. It was August 1914, and that summer the world the immigrants left drifted toward war. It would reach out to touch them. It was a bad autumn for the Mastoni family. In September, the baby, Angelina, aged 11 days, died. Crescenzio Mastoni caught pneumonia and could not work. There were 6 children. The oldest boy, Albert, was 12. World War I in Europe.
Hello, Central, give me no man's land. My daddy's there.
In the first years of the war, England and France poured a generation into the mud of Belgium. There was fighting in the mountains of Italy, and immigrants in America who were still Italian citizens recrossed the Atlantic to die in places along the River Piave and in Caporetto. But the war was a distant thing for Albert Mastoni. He was 12 and working to support his family.
I remember the first job that I got, where I got laborer's pay, was down on Castle Square in Boston. And I was working 12 hours a night, mixing concrete by hand, and my job was to keep the sand loaded into the hopper together with the gravel.
Etta Mastoni is Crescenzio and Maria's second daughter.
He used to go with a shoe shine box, newspapers. He never complained. See, he never spoke to us and said, gee, I wanted to be an engineer and I can't go. He never did.
We would work from 6 at night to 6 in the morning. When I got home, I ate my breakfast and then went to school. And many times I dozed off from school and they would wake me up. But as it happened, I went to a parochial school and the nuns were very lenient. They knew what I was going through.
Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun.
By 1917, America was in the war, and immigrants who had fled Europe to escape the draft found themselves in troop ships heading east across the Atlantic. There was work in Watertown, at the arsenal, building artillery pieces for the Western Front.
In the arsenal, I went in as a construction worker. And then later on, I was put on as an inspector on gun carriages.
Over there, over there.
In 1918, the orders for Watertown's guns stopped. The war in Europe was over. The United States Army listed 130,000 as dead or missing. There were 234,000 wounded. In 1917, there had been revolution in Russia. Bolshevik communism was the new order. For Americans, these facts connected. People wanted no more of Europe's problems or its population. The unions, filled with foreign-born, now seemed to carry the threat of socialism. Mike Tarallo went to union meetings as a young boy.
They didn't call them communists in those days. They called them anarchists. They called them all kinds of foreign names. They were the basis of the unions. The socialists believed in equality, and the union was a method of giving them equality. The only difference is the name. You know, we could have been called the Socialist Union of America or whatever, but it didn't sit right with the administration. It didn't sit right with the Yankees, with the Brahmins, and with all of the people who actually controlled the country.
Turn-of-the-century immigrants emerged from their tenements and reached toward the suburbs. The Jews left the North End for Roxbury, Mattapan, and Brighton. The Irish were in Charlestown and Dorchester. The Armenians moved to Watertown. The Greeks were in Lowell and Roslindale. Sam Gervitz and his family were among the last Jews in the North End.
There were 6 synagogues in the North End, 6 at one time. 3 substantial size synagogues. And approximately 1916, 17, and 18, they began to disappear one at a time until when we moved out of the North End in 1926, there was not a single synagogue in the North End.
Blue sky, smiling at me, nothing but blue sky do I see. Oh, to, bluebird, singing a song, nothing but little bluebird all day long.
The 1920s were not blue skies for everyone. For immigrants, it was a hard time. Jobs were scarce. In 1919, an immigrant had tried to kill the United States Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, triggering mass raids, roundups, arrests, and deportations. In 1920, the Sacco and Vanzetti murder case further inflamed anti-immigrant sentiment. In 1921, Congress passed emergency legislation to stop the flow of immigrants, setting quotas based on country of origin. For the Mastoni family, 1922 was their worst year.
I buried 2 brothers within 3 days of one another. At that time, we used to have the wake in the house.
They used to put white sheets all around the wall, and then the undertaker would come in and embalm them in the house, not out, bring a long table, dress them up, and then measure for the casket, and that was it.
See, they had very little cure in those days for pneumonia. And I can remember the name. My mother used to take this anti-fulgestion plaster. It was a gummy affair, spread it on a cloth, heat it, and put it around the baby's chest. But it was to no avail.
Maybe it was the idea that they didn't know as much as the doctors know today. They were more young ones going than old people then.
One brother died. We took the trimmings down, and my father, I remember it clearly, he said, Al, he says, we've taken it down, but we're going to have to put it up again soon. And in 3 days, we did put it back.
The 20s rolled on. Al Mastoni was 21. He was working in the railroad shops during the daytime and playing violin in the dance halls along the Charles River and at Nantasket Beach at night. He met Catherine de Cesare from Norwell at a dance on North Bennett Street. They wrote often. The future looked good, but not for those who waited to come to America. In 1924, the National Origins Act cut the quotas in half. The processing centers at Ellis Island and on Charlestown's docks fell silent. The great wave of immigration was over. In 100 years, 8 million Irish had come to the United States, a number equal to the entire population of Ireland before the famines. 1/3 of Boston's people were foreign-born. In only 44 years, 25 million immigrants had come to America. It was 1923. On Salem Street, small children collected used whiskey bottles to sell to the bootleggers. On Beacon Hill, the dancing continued. Very soon, it would stop.
I went to work for the Boston and Albany Railroad. And my first job there was in the blacksmith shop. And there I learned how to run steam hammers, air hammers, trip hammers, learned how to temper tools, sharpen tools, and do all types of forms and shapes that was required by my apprenticeship. My mind was set on becoming a civil engineer, but I never was able to make it. It was no fault of either my family or myself. Because of the large family, my dad being sick, certain things that I would have loved to have done could not happen. Although I went to night school and I took several courses, extension courses, and passed every one of them, but that was it. That's the best I could do. The rest was all experience. I had an overall division pass because I was a gang leader, and I had been in the road over 5 years.
Al used his railroad pass to travel to Norwell and see Catherine de Cesare.
My sister and I went shopping up in Rockland, and when I came back, my mother says, we got a telephone call, your father answered the phone, and it was a young man. He said he was your boyfriend, and he's coming down Sunday. Oh my God, if the floor would open up, I would...
We had gone together for, I don't know, maybe 3 years. And I made up my mind that it was either we become serious or else.
My brother had a car, so he took him, his mother, his father, and his sister Phyllis that's dead.
Well, we sat down in the dining room, and of course my father talked, and my mother talked with her mother, and my sister was with her, and I was left there like a mop, I guess, doing nothing but just sitting there and listening to both sides.
Then finally they called me down. Oh, if I didn't fall down them stairs. And his father, you know, told my father that they came to ask for my hand in marriage. Oh, my God.
Then my father made a beautiful speech. He told them how much I was making a week.
You know, I had a good mind to say no just to be spiteful. Because I got mad that he came down.
We were married on September 14th, 1924.
Al and Catherine had the first of 4 children in 1927. Chris Mastoni.
My father was tall, thin, and he had black, shiny shoes. And my greatest thrill was to meet him at North Somerville and get on the train with him and ride into North Station and eat all the hot dogs I could eat. That was my passion.
1929, the year Al and Catherine had their second child, a daughter. The bottom fell out of U.S. Steel stock, and the rest of the country, it seemed. Work was infrequent. Al Mastoni took any job he could. The dance bands were gone. The dance halls were empty.
If I didn't get a job one place, I'd find something else somewhere else, like digging a ditch or helping to build a house or working on a street for a contractor or whatever came my way.
The Depression hit immigrant families harder than most. Rosa Giampola lost her father.
He was a very proud person. My folks had a little bit of cash in one of the banks. Banks closed. Because they owned property, he couldn't get a job with the NRA. So 3 or 4 years, he didn't earn a penny. I always pictured him around, you know, his voice, streets that he would walk. I think of him, you know, at that time, but that was really a tragedy.
The distance between the poor and not so poor in America grew. In parts of the country, desperation was only a brief stop on the way to violence. The Republic Steel Company in Chicago, Illinois. 4 were killed, 87 wounded. By the mid-1930s, Franklin Roosevelt was in the White House. There was the New Deal, the WPA, the Federal Reserve Bank, and a minimum wage. Al Mastoni went back to the railroads, this time for the Boston and Maine, repairing passenger cars for a country that could once again afford a train ticket. He was a young, strong man with highly developed skills. He could turn a screw on a lathe, shape a flange, weld a bead. He could cut steel. He could build things. In 1937, in Hitler's Germany, there was other building going on. The Nazis completed work on their first large concentration camp. Jews began to flee Europe. But their first choice of refuge refused them. No one wanted Europe's Jews. A ship, the St. Louis, arrived in Havana loaded with Jewish refugees. Despite the efforts of Eleanor Roosevelt, the State Department ordered the vessel return to Germany with its passengers. For them, the Statue of Liberty guarded a closed door. Throughout the entire period of Nazi persecution, the immigrant quota from Europe was never filled. In 1938, Albert Mastoni was laid off by the Boston and Maine Railroad. He found immediate work as a ship fitter at the Boston Naval Shipyard. By 1940, he was working a full shift. The yard was hiring everyone they could find.
A date which will live in infamy. United States of America.
Someone had a radio in here and we had heard it over that. It went through here like wildfire. We looked at one another and some of us breathed a silent prayer that it wasn't so because we were thinking of our own children.
The Boston Naval Shipyard built destroyers, repaired light cruisers, and fitted out submarines. When Albert Mastoni built these ships, he and the 20th century were in their 40s. The country was at war, and over 30,000 people worked here at the Boston Naval Yard. He built the ammunition hoist for the forward 3-inch gun turret. He laid out the patterns for the hatches. He and his ship-fitting gang built some of these doors. And then, this destroyer went out to the Pacific. Throughout the 5 years of World War II, whatever had stood between the different groups of immigrants seemed to fall away. In hundreds of factories and shipyards, people who normally would have never met or spoken to each other, worked together for thousands of hours. That happened in Building 104, the foundry shop at the Boston Naval Shipyard in Charlestown.
I had one fellow that was, he was a sailor, and he told me himself, he says he never wore shoes where he came from. And I had a young lady that worked with me that was in that water show in Florida, and she was the best welder that I had ever seen.
One day at the height of the war, Chris Mastoni, now in his 20s, met with his father between shifts.
He said, have you decided what you're going to do? Are you going to go to school or what? Are you going to get a job, a trade, or occupation? And I said to him, yes, I'm going to become a doctor. Well, it was a little different. Then I flipped my lid.
He came over and he said, I want to become a doctor. I didn't believe it, because all my family, we were all tradesmen. Now here's a guy that wants to go to college. And I says, okay, we'll do what we can to help you.
I went to work, believe me, and it killed me, 11 to 3 in Gilchrist. I worked in Gilchrist 7 years.
We put him through medical school. When it came in, the work stopped. Everybody was screaming and yelling and jumping. The girls were kissing the men were kissing the girls.
The war was over. Crescenzio Mastoni was in his late 60s. Throughout the 1950s, he sent money back to Melito to build a church there. Relatives in the town wrote that the villagers had inscribed his name near the front door of the building. In Boston, the children of the immigrants who had laid down the streets of Back Bay and Beacon Hill began to build a new tunnel from the North End to East Boston. Among them were the Black Sandhogs. But what had brought the immigrant and his children forward, hard work, education, and sacrifice, had not worked for the black laborer. Color was still a problem in the building of Boston. Red Moore worked on the Callahan Tunnel.
You got very little bit of work with building trade. They were, you know, very little. You had a hard road to go. Because as soon as the foundation was over, you moved on. It was through with you. They come on, went on up with the building. Our job was always the short end of the stick, you know. Color did have a lot to do with it, quite a bit.
In 1957, after more than 70 years of labor, Crescenzio Mastoni stopped work. In 1960, at the age of 92, he died. The dream of coming to America stayed alive. In 1965, the doors to America, virtually shut since 1924, began to open again with the signing of a new immigration law based on family status and skills rather than nationality. New immigrants came. The trip was easier now. In 1985, 53 Czechs, 8 Hungarians, 52 Poles, 1 German, 50 others from Western Hemisphere countries immigrated to Boston. There were also 22 Chinese, 101 Laotians, 806 Vietnamese, and 1,230 Cambodians. Many of the Cambodians settled in Revere, and what happened 70 years ago on Salem Street happens today on Highland Street.
Vandalism lead into harassment and violence against the Cambodian people, the Asian here, who live around here.
Ratha Yem fled the Khmer Rouge after the fall of Phnom Penh.
Let's be honest that it's racism, you know, they don't like us, and they say that, you know, these people coming from overseas, and basically just a color that make us so vulnerable.
And will the applicants for citizenship kindly raise your right hand? I.
On Tuesday, April 22nd, Ratha Yem and 300 new American citizens took the oath of allegiance at Faneuil Hall.
I will support and defend.
Support and defend.
The Constitution and laws.
Constitution and law.
By 1956, Al Mastoni had worked for 40 years when he took a second job. The man who was born in the Paul Revere house came back to Salem Street to the Old North Church as sexton, which is where he is tonight. And then there is the town of Melito. In 1981, an earthquake shook central Italy. Avellino province was hit badly. No one lives in the old town of Melito today. Most of the roofs are down, but the church is still there. The earthquake of 1980 took this church. There are swallows in what is left of the roof, and the main altar is open to the sky. The statues are gone, so are the chandeliers. It is a hidden ruin in a hidden valley. But still it is a connection between Crescenzio Mastoni and America. The memorial plaque is unharmed, and the sheep still run through the town. What started here stays here. It has left its mark. What began in America is unfinished and continues today.
I could picture him walking down those streets, herding sheep, all alone. No mother, no father. No man could ask for a better man than he was.